It has been a very moving experience for a Chinese, Italian, Anglo-Buddhist Australian to see these timelessly beautiful artworks, while at the same time watching the Chinese open their hearts to the world through the Olympics. It has symbolised for me the hope that China will also uncover and honour its wealth of buried spiritual wisdom. And I agree with Lindy Lee, these are the most exquisite Buddhist sculptures that I have ever seen. Tonight I'm going to talk to you about my spiritual journey. When I think of my Chinese family's spiritual roots, I think of my dad's older sister, Auntie Margaret, who converted to Christianity on the Queensland goldfields just a few years after the White Australia policy was introduced. One day, when she was 9 or 10, Auntie Margaret saw a missionary ride into town and was smitten by his tales from the Bible. She said to Maggie, her mother, my grandmother, "Mama, you can beat me, but I won't light incense in those joss houses ever again. I believe in Jesus." And she believed unflinchingly in Jesus. She was a member of the Pentecostal church until the day she died at 100. Much to her delight, at the age of 56, her mother, my grandmother, a seasoned gambler, saw a vision of Jesus coming over the horizon and also became a devout Pentecostal Christian. So religion for me started with my Chinese family because my father read the Bible and because his family were all Pentecostal Christians. There was never any mention of the religion they'd followed before that missionary rode into town and converted Auntie Margaret. To this day, I don't know whether they were Buddhists or Taoists or followers of Confucius. Growing up for me spiritually was all about Jesus. Growing up for me, spirituality was all about Jesus. I went to Sunday school and I topped the class in my exams. I also had a great love for Jesus. In fact, when I took my first acid trip by a riverbank in England in 1966, the height of the experience was a glorious vision of Jesus surrounded by light in the sky. But that was the last time Jesus played any significant role in my life. I came back to Australia and I started Flamingo Park and I had a baby, and my life was all about the business and family and art and design. And there wasn't really a lot of room for spirituality. Until Granville. My daughter Grace, 22 months old, and I were in the first carriage of the train that ploughed into a bridge in Granville on January the 18th, 1977. It was the most devastating train crash in Australian history. 83 people died and 213 were injured. And Grace and I walked away shell-shocked, but with only minor physical injuries. I was in a heightened state of sensitivity for many months after Granville. I was convinced that Grace and I had somehow been protected, and that led to 100 questions about life and death and the nature of being. Who or what was our protector? Why were we spared? For days I would be obsessed with the need to understand, and then I would fall into a crumpled heap and sob. My nerves were shot. But out of this terrifying near-death experience came an explosion of creativity. I began painting, sitting at the kitchen table in the mountains with black ink and colour, making shapes and patterns. It was my therapy, and it was also a turning point in my design. The moment when I moved beyond doing my own take on period knitting patterns, Australian motifs, and elementary symbols, to creating more complex compositions. I couldn't stop painting and designing. That was the gift of being alive, and that's how I expressed it. I whispered thank you many times while I worked or took long walks in the healing bush. From then on, I found my solace, my spiritual centre, and my creative inspiration in nature. I was absolutely fascinated by Aboriginal art and design and exploring the way Indigenous cultures connect to nature. And from that exploration of Aboriginal art and sense of place, I developed an instinctive feeling for the waratah, which became my totem. When I walked in the bush after fires, I saw them explode into bloom from their beds of ashes, their crimson hearts open to the sun. I was astonished that such beauty could spring from such devastation. They became symbols of rebirth and resilience, and also of my own fiery emotions. I was going through a particular fiery patch in my marriage to the artist Michael Ramsden. The Blue Mountains were ablaze with fires. I remember coming home one day to a scene of smouldering red and black bush and feeling an eerie parallel between the landscape and my emotions. I needed to do something to keep all these fires at a manageable intensity. So I hot-footed it off to the Siddha Yoga ashram at Dulwich Hill. For a while there, I chanted and meditated at the ashram every week, and I felt a particular connection to the Hindu goddess Kali, who presided over destruction and rebirth. I felt that the waratah symbolised Kali and nature, but Siddha Yoga never truly felt like my spiritual home. On a trip to Thailand with my daughter Grace in 1986, I experienced one of the great turning points of my life. I was introduced to Siddharma, a young Buddhist nun with a face like the moon, who was caring for a forest monk called Fra Ajahn Ponsak Tejadamo. I called him simply Ajahn, which means Buddhist teacher. I stayed for weeks at his meditation retreat beside one of Thailand's most sacred caves, 2 hours south of Chiang Mai. I slept in a wooden hut and had only a gas bottle, a few candles and a torch, and some food. I remember waking as the sun rose on our first morning, watching golden light stream in between the wooden slats. I opened the door and there was Ajahn, standing outside, his face as radiant as the sun. I had an audience with Ajahn. I felt he was speaking to my heart about the sacredness of nature. He told me he had been a forest monk for nearly 40 years and had watched the disappearance of the trees and the wildlife they sheltered. Ajahn articulated the link I'd felt between spirituality and nature, but he took it one step further towards responsibility.